Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Sex, Money, Murder, a story of crack, blood, and betrayal, by Jonathan Green. Read by Keith Sellon-Wright. Any city, however small, is in fact divided into two, one the city of the poor, the other of the rich. These are at war with one another. Plato, Commonwealth, Book 4. Author's Note: the founding members of the gang Sex, Money, Murder are masters of the art of deception, and use violence to propel themselves to the top of a hierarchy. So there are inherent challenges for a journalist seeking to document the truth in their story. Hundreds of hours of digitally recorded interviews with all four of my main sources are bolstered by court transcripts, Freedom of Information Act, FOIA requests, document requests from the New York City Police Department and the Bronx District Attorney, and hundreds of subsidiary interviews. My methodology in recreating scenes of dialogue or action, some of which took place 20 years ago or more, was to buttress face-to-face interviews with scores of follow-up calls or texts to my sources to learn, for example, a particular facial expression, or the music that may have been playing at the time, or any other small observations that enabled me to render these scenes with greater accuracy and detail. Notwithstanding, the human memory is inaccurate and often subjective. Wherever possible, I have tried to corroborate with other gang members or police officers, and in some cases I have had the benefit of old photographs. I have had access to crime scene videos and stills and to police reports, some culled by a private investigator and a lawyer working on my behalf. Requests for medical records, juvenile criminal records, and further documents from the U.S. Attorney's Office under FOIA were repeatedly denied. In some instances, I have used street names or a pseudonym to protect the identities of those in the Federal Witness Protection Program. I bear responsibility for any errors of fact in this book. Act 1. Sound View. The Genesis of Violence. Prologue. The Roof. Up high, on the pebbled tar roof overlooking the projects, Shug took another hit from his blunt. He held the smoke in his lungs, welcoming the rush in his limbs, the warmth over his skin, and finally the numbing of his mind. It would help deaden his conscience for the murder he was about to commit. When Shug allowed the purplish smoke to escape his mouth, it hung briefly like a gossamer in front of the Manhattan skyline before gusting winds snatched it away. It was Thanksgiving Day, 1997. Shug gripped the heavy Colt .45 pistol in his hoodie pocket, warm now after resting in his hand for so long, its weight reassuring him. He let himself stare over the smokestacks and flat roofs of the Bronx to the skyscrapers 2 miles southwest in Midtown, the Empire State, the chrome spine of the Chrysler Building, before turning his gaze to the Upper East Side, the most expensive real estate in the United States, a world created by rich white men and the dynasties that had built America. 7 stories below, at 1704 Randall Avenue, where crack vials littered the ground, he could see the bleak open squares of concrete hemmed in by blank red walls and row upon row of dark, empty windows. Everyone here knew to stay away from the windows. The kids in Soundview called the roof that Shug was on Pebble Beach. A decade earlier, when he was a boy and Manhattan felt like a faraway kingdom, Shug had brought girls up here on dates, looked out with them at the metropolis, and told them one day he would be a millionaire. The brackish air off Long Island Sound was getting cooler. Shug's right lung ached as he held the smoke in. A scar 10 inches below his armpit marked where a bullet had entered, burst his lung, and dragged him down into a coma. Now he stamped his feet and rasped a couple of times to help his breathing. Shug was 5'6", a lean stack of knotted muscle. His broad mouth and upper jaw revealed 2 front teeth with a slight gap set above a defiant, jutting chin. Hyperkinetic, never fully at rest, he passed the blunt back and forth to a tough, sinewy kid called Mac 11, who had earned his name for his skill with a submachine gun. Outside the stairwell, someone had sprayed a familiar tag, SMM, short for sex, money, murder. SMM was one of the most feared sets, like battalions in an army, of the United Blood Nation. Shug was a general and head of security, and this was his territory, the Soundview houses. To outsiders, Soundview was a jungle, gang-run, crack-blighted, its residents held prisoner by fear and violence. To Shug, it was a place of safety from the police and rival gangs, a fortress and a powerful state within a state. Randall Avenue was the only way into Soundview and the only way out, as if urban planners had built the place with defense in mind. Inside these walls, Shug's authority was unquestioned. Soundview lived by rules laid down by him and his brethren. Beneath the grid of dark rooftops was a vast market for the crack his crew supplied. The orders that had brought Shug to the rooftop came down from SMM's godfather and Shug's childhood friend, Pistol Pete. Where Shug was raw and forthright, Pete flashed a 1,000-watt grin and then slipped behind you to shoot you in the back of the skull. He was only 5'7", but he ruled the black underworld through fear and a Robin Hood reputation that made him a hero among young dealers throughout the projects. Pete came from an American drug dynasty. His father had worked with drug kingpin Nicky Barnes in the 1970s, and then helped to establish another syndicate in the early 1980s to bring high-grade heroin to Harlem and the Bronx with the Mafia. But by the mid-1990s, Pete's crack empire had made him more powerful and respected in the underworld than his father ever was. And while the Mafia had Sinatra and the Rat Pack, Pistol Pete had New York rappers like Lord Tariq and Peter Guns, who rhymed about his life and crimes. Pete was a celebrity, spending time in clubs with Tyra Banks, Sean Combs, Puff Daddy, later P. Diddy, and the Ralph Lauren model Tyson Beckford. The Pistol was incarcerated on federal drug and weapons charges in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg County Central Jail in North Carolina. But he could dictate life or death in Soundview any time. The week before, he had phoned Shug from jail and said that David Twin Mullins, their friend and fellow gang member, was a snitch. "Twin gots to go," Pete told him. Although it was never explicitly stated, committing the murder would give Shug OG, or original gangster, status. This might mean he'd get his own autonomous subset under the aegis of sex, money, murder. At first, Shug didn't wholly believe that Twin had ratted. For a start, Twin had higher status than Shug in SMM. He was Pistol Pete's partner. He and his twin brother, Damon Mullins, were well liked in Soundview. And not only was Twin a wealthy drug dealer, but he too had murdered for SMM out of loyalty, killing those who had planned to murder Pete. But then Shug stopped himself. You never analyzed, fed your conscience with doubts before a murder, asking why you would kill one friend to remain loyal to another. That would almost certainly get you killed. And in Soundview, you never went back on a job like this. Faking moves got you killed too. If Shug failed to murder him, Twin's retaliation would be swift. He would almost certainly kill Shug, and Shug assumed they might come for his grandmother, who also lived in Soundview. Over several weeks, Pete had convinced Shug that eliminating Twin was the only way to get Pete out of prison. Twin was cooperating with prosecutors on his case, he claimed, and his evidence and testimony would put Pete away for life. On the roof, Shug pushed away any doubts. He never evaluated the consequences. It simply wasn't in his DNA. The perfect gang member, ruthless, unquestioning to a fault. Twin had to die today. Under his hoodie, Shug wore a bulletproof vest, a Kevlar plate strapped over his chest. He had loaded the .45 with alternating hollow points and full metal jacket bullets. The hollow points would spin irregularly through the body cavity, shredding organs as they went. But if his mark wore a bulletproof vest, The solid bullets had a chance of puncturing the Kevlar without fragmenting first. Below him, on the large patch of grass between 1704 and 1680 Randall, he could see 30 football players in bright colors warming up, getting ready for the annual Turkey Bowl between the Soundview and neighboring Castle Hill projects that had been a tradition for 5 years. Supposedly this was the one day when guns and animosities between rival drug dealers would be set aside or expressed only through football. Even so, many players wore bulletproof vests. Mac 11 peered over the edge and relayed that Shug's target wore a white Dallas Cowboys jersey with the number 21 in royal blue. Shug tracked several of his SMM allies in on the murder scheme down below. Several of Twin's men, he suspected, were armed and ready to protect him, so some of the SMM men had discreetly positioned themselves directly behind them. When Shug started shooting, a man called Total Package would pass a .38 revolver under his puffy jacket to Green Eyes, another SMM gangster standing next to him. Green Eyes would kill Twin's bodyguard and any of his retinue who might attempt to shoot back. Other SMM members were armed and stationed at strategic exits from the projects, blocking anyone from escaping. The three talked easily with Twin before the game, rocking him to sleep. This was a familiar SMM move. They lulled their victims into a false sense of security with friendliness, masking their deadly intentions before murdering them. On the roof, the wind clawed at Shug, and a thick scar on his head throbbed in the cold. The pain was the legacy of a pistol whipping he had suffered 7 years earlier. Pistol Pete had orchestrated the murder of the culprit who had hurt Shug, so now Shug was going to repay the favor by killing for Pete. On Thanksgiving night, a wind blew over the yard at Cayuga Correctional Facility in upstate New York as Emilio "Pipe" Romero, an SMM boss serving time for attempted murder, moved through his daily workout. An original gangster, Pipe was the highest-ranking blood in the prison and commanded a powerful and growing army of inmates. Pipe made $1,000 a week selling other prisoners drugs that were smuggled up from Soundview by an SMM soldier. He also smuggled in Blue Gem Star razor blades, wrapped in electrical tape to slip past the metal-detecting wands the guards passed over all visitors. Pipe used some blades to cut up crack. Others he sold for $25 each. Known as bangers, the blades were the perfect jailhouse weapon for the $1.50 face slashings, so called for the 150 stitches to the face that a victim required, for which the Bloods had a reputation. Pipe cast an eye out to the woods in the darkness beyond the wire. He had been denied parole yet again at his latest hearing. Still, he enjoyed Thanksgiving lunch, the energy powering his workout. When his security detail asked if he wanted to go into the dorms with the 8:45 p.m. return, he declined. The bars were cold to the touch as he used his arms and chest to lower his body toward the ground, then lift it up again. He enjoyed the satisfying burn of his muscles and let his mind drift back to the annual football game in Soundview. He had last played in 1994. Back then he was only 120 pounds, the baby of SMM and years younger than the rest. But he'd caught several touchdown passes. The year before, in 1993, Twin and Pistol Pete had gone after each other relentlessly. By the next year they were friends again and business partners, scoring at will for the Sex Money Murder football team. No one wanted to tackle either of them too hard. He thought of the high times with Twin, rolling into the Tunnel nightclub in downtown Manhattan in a fleet of black Chevrolet Suburbans, Mercedes Coupes, and Toyota Land Cruisers. They had a phrase, "Make it rain," and they threw money around like confetti. They bought dozens of bottles of champagne at a time, though they weren't old enough to legally drink. One time, Twin shot dead a man who had been sent up from North Carolina to assassinate Pistol Pete as the apocalyptic bass of Biggie's "Gimme the Loot" reverberated around the club. Twin, Pipe, and Pistol Pete had carried out murders together and shared money, cars, and women. their bond was stronger than family ties. Now Pipe was hearing rumors that Twin was 999, cooperating with law enforcement, and that he was to be killed. In fact, Pipe's brother, Roe, a young blood looking to enhance his reputation in the neighborhood, had written to him to say that he had almost shot one of the Doublemints, blood code for Twin and his identical brother. Pipe knew Twin wasn't snitching. Sometime over the past few weeks he had written back and ordered his brother to stand down. If Twin were cooperating, Pipe would also be up on a federal indictment, because Pete, Twin, and Pipe had committed some of their most serious crimes together. In his latest letter, Pipe had ordered his brother to stay near the phone so that he could call and explain the situation and give orders. Yet every time he called, Roe wasn't there. Pipe called Shug repeatedly, but he too seemed to be ducking the calls. Pipe had heard nothing from Pistol Pete about Twin being a snitch and marked for death. Pipe tried not to dwell on it, but the feeling of powerlessness was nearly unbearable. He could only hope that his brother and the other bloods in Soundview would follow his orders and not murder Twin, who was like a brother to him. Pipe had become a sort of moral compass for SMM. He balked at the killing sometimes and urged the younger members to focus more on making money than murder. He reminded them that their purpose was to rise up out of poverty, not to kill one another off. At 9:45 p.m., Pipe headed inside. In the dorms, rows of beds were separated by light blue chest-high dividers. His red slippers were waiting for him, sitting on a red rug near a red towel. He had posted no pictures of family or friends in his cubicle lest they become targets. Instead, he put up a picture of Janelle, an off-and-on squeeze, wearing a thong bikini and crawling on all fours. Running up her right thigh was a series of dog-paw tattoos, part of the blood's iconography. He planned to call friends in the neighborhood after his shower and see who had won the game. As the youngest on the Bronx's new gang investigation squad, 30-year-old Detective Pete Forselli had been ordered to work Thanksgiving. He had been handpicked by the Bronx's chief of detectives to lead the squad, an indication that his reputation for ambition and drive was being recognized by the brass. For the time being, though, the unit was housed in a former closet in the 45th Precinct. Their first target was sex, money, murder. All over the city, the crack epidemic had birthed neighborhood crews who had made housing projects impregnable dominions. From their base in Soundview, SMM had become a multi-million-dollar enterprise that offered murder for hire and cut distribution deals for crack in a dozen cities in half a dozen states. In the Bronx, they were taking over projects like Bronx River and Castle Hill. Forselli's informants told him that there were scores of murders attributable to the group. Forselli didn't like to work the day shift. Most of the action took place at night, when he could jump from murder scene to murder scene, running on adrenaline, and ending his shift when the dawn's first light swept over the city, then making a trip to Gold's Gym. The gym was his sanctuary, a place where he could enjoy his solitude and forget about work and the pressures of supporting his family on a young detective's salary. Inspired by Sylvester Stallone in Rambo and Rocky, Forselli could bench 300 pounds. He had been married for only a few years, and his wife did most of the child care. She would be alone with their 3-year-old daughter and 18-month-old son today on Thanksgiving. This, Forselli told himself, was what it took to be a detective. The Bronx was the center of a homicide epidemic in New York, with more than half the city's murders in the late 1980s and early 1990s. While there had been concern over the killings, which peaked in 1990 at 2,605, they had been largely ignored. Black drug dealers murdering black drug dealers was a problem no one wanted to deal with. Instead, the front pages of the New York Post were devoted to the feds and their elite anti-mafia units waging war on the 5 families. A recent internecine war among Colombo crime family members in Brooklyn had seen 11 killed, garnering 24-hour news coverage. Yet, in a 3-block area in Hunts Point over the Bronx River from Soundview, 3 times that number had been killed in a few months. The murders of black kids barely made the papers. Forselli had chalked up hundreds of arrests in the southeast Bronx where he'd seen two close colleagues shot and killed. As a housing cop, his was viewed as one of the most perilous of assignments. In 1996, those who lived in New York public housing were 3 times more likely to be hit by gunfire than residents in the rest of the city. Forselli had started as a patrolman 10 years earlier, and Soundview had been his beat. He'd seen boys in the neighborhoods come of age in the early days of crack, carrying out shootings before they'd been through puberty. They reminded him of child soldiers in Africa, hardened to violence by years of exposure, eyes bloodshot from weed, and unquestioningly subservient to neighborhood gangsters who acted like rebel commanders. Forselli had chased down kids armed with machine guns who had enough money stashed in their apartments to pay his salary for 5 years. Some of them were third-generation Soundview gangsters whose fathers were dead or in prison. They saw themselves carrying on a family dynasty, taking their best shot at the American dream. As he made his way up the steps of the 45th Precinct building and passed through the tall, thick oak doors, Forselli always felt inspired and at ease. The place was a bastion, left over from a time when the rule of law was respected. It reinforced his sense of purpose. In a city where the police were largely disparaged and distrusted, the 45th held its ground. The precinct was sleepy on Thanksgiving. Forselli found his partner and another detective hunched over a little TV watching football. Above the noise, Forselli sifted through the paperwork on his desk, then decided to head out on his own. He climbed into an unmarked Ford Windstar and headed west along the Bruckner Expressway toward Soundview. Today, the gangsters in the neighborhood would be visiting relatives and baby mothers, all the people they might run to if they were wanted on warrants. A few days earlier, Forselli had spoken to John O'Malley, an investigator with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York and the best detective he had ever worked with. O'Malley was tall and silver-haired, a native of Soundview. He had developed a reputation in law enforcement for equanimity and fairness, and for his mastery at winning the trust of gangsters while getting them working for the prosecution. He had helped pioneer the federal takedown of street gangs in the Bronx, and he had a particular interest in sex-money murder because of their ultra-violent reputation and the fact that they were in his old neighborhood. Forselli had talked to O'Malley about a change in strategy in the Bronx. They had gotten permission to prosecute SMM and other gangs under the federal racketeering laws known as RICO, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, first developed to prosecute the mafia. When Forselli first made detective in 1993, he caught new murder cases every week and got only 4 days to work a case before moving on to the next. For years, Forselli had tried to arrest corner crack dealers and killers, only to see them released a few days later after terrified witnesses in the projects refused to help the police, let alone testify in open court. Even if a jury convicted gangsters, when they went inside they had their teeth fixed and lifted weights to get back in shape while running their operations from their cells before returning to the street more powerful than before. Now, finally, he had the luxury of time to strategize, investigate, and build a full case against sex-money murder. Forselli and his team were now backed by the authority to request the death penalty and life sentences for major offenders. It was all part of a major push by the U.S. Attorney's Office to reclaim neighborhoods from the gangs and to break the generational cycle of sons following their fathers into prison. In Soundview and tough inner-city neighborhoods like it, a state prison term had become a rite of manhood and even held some romance. Using RICO, just as the feds did with mafiosos such as Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, the authorities would offer some street gangsters the chance to cooperate. If they refused, they would go to prison in a place far away from the Bronx, beyond the reach of family, to serve life terms. This was all part of a weed and seed strategy. Once the hardcore gangsters in the neighborhood were swept up and removed, An injection of federal money for social services would help rejuvenate the area. As Forcelli slowed and turned onto Randall Avenue, the massive shadows of the Soundview projects loomed over him. On the corner of Commonwealth Avenue and Randall, mothers tugged their children past a few recalcitrant drug dealers in hoodies waiting for passing trade at the spot known as Cozy Corner. Even the local priest from Holy Cross didn't come through here unless he was wearing his clerical collar. Cops at the precinct said you could spot a license plate here from any state of the Union. Today, Forcelli ignored the hustlers and instead drove in and out of parking lots, slowly and methodically pausing occasionally to write down plate numbers. He entered the horseshoe-shaped road at the center of the projects and made his way past 1710 Randall. Drawing alongside a small grassy patch between the buildings, he saw young men assembled in jerseys warming up for a football game. He decided to get some lunch. Nothing seemed amiss. He would never have thought to look up to the top of the building where two faces were peering down. Shug saw one of the SMM men on the field looking up at him in greeting. He snapped his head back, walking away from the roof's edge. The crowd from Castle Hill was much larger than he had anticipated, which meant that he could be more easily identified, or shot if he bungled the killing. Shug took a last hit from his blunt to fortify himself. "You ready, Mo?" he asked. Mac 11 nodded, his eager face framed by a goatee and shoulder-length cornrows. He was ready to make a name for himself by killing for sex-money murder. As they moved to the stairwell door, Shug briefly wondered if he'd ever see the Manhattan rooftops again. Then he and Mac 11 vaulted down the stairs, which always reeked of urine, and descended to the ground floor. Outside, Shug dropped his joint and ground it out under his black sneaker. He noticed that Mac 11's face wasn't concealed. "Yo, cover your face, Mo," he said. But Mac 11 was too amped to take advice, focusing instead on his target. "Fuck that," said Mac 11. "We in the hood. Ain't nobody going to say nothing." Fool, thought Shug as he pulled his hood up and laced the drawstrings under his chin so that only part of his eyes and nose was visible. But it was too late now. Shug needed to focus on his own task. Together they walked directly across the field in the middle of a play before Mac 11 veered to the left. Halfway through, it occurred to Shug to slow his gait, to bounce in on his toes casually as if warming up for the game. Twin had just made a play but was crouching over the ball ready to snap back to the Castle Hill team. Shug walked up behind him, closing the distance, his right hand around the butt of the pistol. He went through a mental checklist. Was the gun chambered? What was the recoil like so he could be ready for subsequent shots from the blowback of the first? A Smith & Wesson 9mm was tucked into the waistband of his black track pants as a backup. He quickly traced its outline. Just 8 yards away, Twin turned from the scrum to look directly into Shug's eyes. Shug pressed on, pulling out the gun. The long barrel of the .45 got stuck in his hoodie pocket. He fumbled, extended his arm, and aimed at Twin's head. Twin gave a knowing look that would haunt Shug for the rest of his life. Shug squeezed. He didn't hear the crack of the big gun. Instead, he heard the thump of the bullet going low and hitting Twin's body. He fired one more. This time he heard a sharp whiplash report. Then the gun jammed. Panicked, he tried to rack the slide, jiggled at the trigger. Nothing. Chaos erupted around him. Mac 11 had crossed the field to go after the other twin, hitting him in the backside, but after Shug's shots he blazed rounds indiscriminately. Ephraim E-Man Solar, Twin's bodyguard, started to reach for a gun, but he was too late. Green Eyes shot him multiple times with the revolver total package had passed him according to plan, but then he ran out of bullets. Solar staggered, still alive, lunging for Green Eyes' throat. In a frenzy, Green Eyes tried to pistol-whip him to death. Mac 11 gave up chasing the other twin and circled back. He shot E-Man in the head with a bullet that cleaved his skull. In the melee, 2 other bystanders were hit.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?